Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big topic, something that affects pretty much all of us now. Electromagnetic fields, EMFs, and also radiofrequency radiation, RF.
Yeah, the stuff from all our wireless gadgets.
Exactly. We're going deep into the Bioinitiative 2012 report.
That's right. And, this isn't just a casual opinion piece. It's a very substantial report put together by an international group, 29 scientists, doctors, public health experts.
From 10 countries I saw.
Yeah. So it's a serious attempt to pull together the research.
And these aren't just any experts. We're talking top-tier credentials, MDs, PhDs, people who've, led the Bioelectromagnetic Society.
Mm-hmm. Advised European agency.
Right. Chaired the Russian National Committee on non-ionizing radiation. So really heavily credentialed group.
Definitely. And their main goal, pulling all this research together, was to really get to grips with the biological effects, specifically from low-intensity exposures.
Low intensity, okay.
Yeah, from both ELF, that's extremely low frequency, from electricity.
Power lines, appliances.
Right. And RF, radio frequency, from all the wireless stuff. And the big question they're asking is, fundamentally, are our current safety standards actually protective enough?
Okay, so our mission today, for everyone listening, is really to pull out the key scientific points from this, pretty massive report.
Yeah, it's dense.
We want to give you a clear look at their perspective on safety standards and what they recommend for public health. It's definitely a complex field, often debated.
For sure.
So we're aiming to give you a shortcut to understanding what this significant report is actually saying. So maybe let's start with the basics. What exactly are these EMFs we're discussing?
Okay, so the report really focuses on two main kinds. First, you've got extremely low frequency, ELF.
Right.
These come from anything using or carrying electrical power. So yeah, power lines, home wiring, your fridge, your lamp.
The background hum of modern life, basically.
Pretty much. And the second type is radio frequency radiation, RF.
Okay.
And that's from all the wireless communication. Cell phones, cordless phones, Wi-Fi routers, cell towers, broadcast towers.
So anything sending signals through the air, more or less. And crucially, both of these, ELF and RF, they're forms of non-ionizing radiation, correct?
Yes, that's a really important distinction. Non-ionizing radiation doesn't have the energy to, knock electrons off atoms and directly break DNA bonds the way X-rays or gamma rays do.
Okay.
But the core concern of the Bioinitiative report isn't about that kind of direct damage. It's about other biological effects that might be happening even at these lower non-ionizing energy levels.
Right. Which brings us to their main point, doesn't it? They're not saying our phones are cooking us.
No, not at typical exposure levels.
But they are looking at these subtle low-intensity effects and arguing pretty strongly that our current safety standards, they might be falling short.
That sums it up well. The report explicitly states that current public safety standards are, and I quote, far from adequate to protect public health. That's a central theme running through the whole thing.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Far from adequate. That's blunt. So what's driving that conclusion? What kind of approach are they advocating for setting these limits?
Well, this is where the idea of the precautionary principle really comes in. They discuss it quite a bit.
Oh.
Essentially, it means that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing significant harm, even if the scientific evidence isn't totally conclusive yet, the burden of proof falls on those taking the action to show it's not harmful. It's about being cautious.
So better safe than sorry, basically. If there's a credible hint of danger, we should act to reduce exposure, even without 100% proof.
Precisely. And the report actually suggests we might not even know if there is a safe lower limit for some of these effects. So given that uncertainty, they argue that just carrying on business as usual, constantly rolling out new tech that increases everyone's exposure, often involuntarily, that's maybe not the wisest public health strategy.
That makes sense. If we keep adding layers of exposure without fully understanding the long-term consequences of the low levels, yeah, that feels risky. And they also talk about who should be making these decisions, right? It's not just for scientists.
Absolutely. They stress it needs to be a broader conversation. Of course, you need the scientists, but you also need public health officials, policymakers, and importantly, the public involved.
Okay.
Because these decisions aren't purely scientific, they involve societal values. How much risk are we willing to accept for the convenience of technology? That kind of thing needs to be part of the discussion alongside the scientific data.
Right. Science tells us what might happen, but society has to decide what's acceptable. Okay, so a call for caution and broader input. Let's get into the specifics then. What scientific evidence does the report point to most strongly?
One of the most prominent areas is childhood leukemia. The report points to what they call a consistent association between exposure to ELF magnetic fields, again, think power lines, electrical wiring, and higher rates of childhood leukemia.
Consistent association.
Yeah, and this evidence was strong enough that the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IRC, classified ELF magnetic fields as a Group 2B carcinogen back in 2002.
Group 2B, that means possibly carcinogenic to humans, right?
Exactly, based on these epidemiological studies finding that link repeatedly.
Okay. Childhood leukemia is obviously a huge concern. So the report sees this ELF link as a well-established red flag.
That's certainly how they present it, yes.
Yeah.
Highlighting the consistency across multiple studies leading to that IRC classification.
Okay. What about other cancers? Does the report connect EMFs to anything else?
Yes, they also look closely at breast cancer, linking it potentially to ELF exposure as well in both men and women.
Really? Men too?
Yes. The report cites epidemiological studies suggesting increased risk for people with higher ELF exposure both at home, so residential, and at work, occupational exposure.
That's concerning. Is there any proposed mechanism? How might ELF fields affect breast cancer risk?
Well, they point to animal studies where ELF exposure seemed to increase mammary tumor size and incidence. And maybe more significantly, lab studies in vitro work suggest that ELF fields, even at typical environmental levels, can interfere with the protective effects of melatonin.
Melatonin, the sleep hormone.
Right. Melatonin also has anti-cancer properties, particularly against breast cancer cells, and ELF exposure might reduce those benefits. Some studies even suggest it could interfere with the effectiveness of the breast cancer drug tamoxifen.
Wow. So not just potentially increasing risk, but maybe hindering treatment too. That's quite significant.
It is, and based on this evidence, particularly the potential link at fairly low environmental levels, maybe around 2 or 3 milligauss,
Okay.
the report strongly recommends that the public exposure limits for ELF need to be reconsidered, likely lowered, to account for this potential breast cancer risk.
Okay, a clear call for reassessment there.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears slightly. What about the brain? How might EMFs affect brain function or behavior, according to the report?
The report covers this too. It discusses findings, mainly from animal studies, showing that both ELF and RF exposures, even at low levels, can actually change normal brainwave patterns, the EEG activity, and also influence behavior in animals.
And what about in humans? We're constantly using RF devices near our heads.
Well, the report states it's a pretty established fact that using a cell phone does affect the electrical activity in the human brain. That's been shown in studies.
Right. Makes sense given the proximity.
Yeah.
But are they talking about just heating effects again?
No, they're looking beyond that. The report highlights research suggesting the effects can be quite nuanced. For instance, how much your brain is affected might depend on your mental workload at the time.
How so?
Like if you're already concentrating hard on something, the added EMF exposure might sort of overload the system more easily. There's also evidence suggesting cell phone use can speed up brain activity temporarily,
Okay.
but potentially at the cost of efficiency or maybe even impairing judgment slightly. So faster isn't necessarily better.
Interesting. So it's not just on or off, but how the brain is working. Now, something really fundamental. DNA. Does the report suggest low-level EMFs can damage our DNA? That sounds serious.
Yes, this is another major area of concern they raise. The report argues that both ELF and RF exposures should be considered potentially genotoxic, meaning capable of damaging DNA under certain conditions.
Okay.
And the critical part is this includes exposure levels below the current safety limits that are based on heating.
Below the limits. Wow. What's the evidence for that?
They cite lab studies, in vitro work again, showing ELF EMF exposure inducing DNA damage in human cells. And interestingly, some studies found the effect was stronger in cells from older donors.
Really? Why would that be?
The suggestion is that maybe our cells' ability to repair DNA damage might decline with age, making older individuals potentially more vulnerable to this kind of effect from EMFs.
That's sobering. And this ties back to the criticism of the safety standards.
Absolutely. The report argues that standards focused only on preventing heating are essentially irrelevant for protecting against this kind of genotoxicity, which can happen at much lower non-thermal levels. The energy involved in ELF causing effects can be, as they point out, vastly lower than RF, yet biological responses still occur.
So the heat-based standards might be missing a whole category of potential harm.
Okay.
The report also mentioned something called electrical hypersensitivity, or EHS. What is that?
Right, EHS. It's described as a condition where people report experiencing a variety of symptoms, sometimes quite debilitating ones like headaches, fatigue, skin issues, concentration problems when they're exposed to EMFs.
And how widespread is this? Is it medically recognized?
Well, the report notes it's considered a growing problem. Estimates vary, but they suggest maybe 3% to 5% of the population might experience disabling symptoms. And while it's controversial in some places, Sweden actually officially recognizes EHS as a functional impairment.
A functional impairment. What does that mean practically?
It means that while they don't classify it as a specific disease, they acknowledge it's a real condition that can seriously impact someone's ability to function, work, and live normally, and may require accommodations or support.
Okay, that's significant. So what does the Bioinitiative Report recommend regarding people with EHS?
They argue strongly that public health policy needs to consider this sensitive group. They call for better ways to evaluate the risks for these individuals and, crucially, for strategies to reduce their exposures. It's about acknowledging that a one-size-fits-all standard might not work for everyone.
Taking vulnerable populations into account.
Okay.
What about the immune system, another crucial defense mechanism? Does the report see impacts there?
Yes, definitely. The research reviewed suggests that current international safety limits might not be sufficiently protective for immune function either.
What kind of effects are we talking about?
It's quite varied. Some studies report things like an overreaction of the immune system, physical changes in the structure of immune cells, an increase in mast cells involved in allergies, changes in lymphocyte viability, and even reduced numbers of natural killer cells, or NK cells.
NK cells are important for fighting infections and cancer, right?
Critically important, yes. So a reduction could be significant. It seems EMF exposure might disrupt the normal balance and function of the immune system in several ways.
Not just suppression, but maybe dysregulation.
That seems to be the implication. And some research even suggests the effects of RF on immune cells might depend on what stage of division the cell is in when it's exposed. It's complex.
Very complex.
This first part of the analysis is very interesting. In episode 11, we'll dive into part 2 of this fascinating discussion. Don't miss our podcast deep dive into EMFs. See you in the next episode.